Good evening. Welcome.
Okay. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. Welcome everybody to this session. This is on the subject of technology and regulation and looking at how regulation is evolving to rapidly responding healthcare markets, and particularly the development of e-pharmacy. Now you should be able to see me. There I am. Great. So I'm Cara Hansen. I'm from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I'm going to, together with Prasanna Salingra, I'm going to be chairing this session on e-pharmacy. One of the things that's become a really very widely observed during the recent year of COVID is the rapid proliferation of e-commerce in general and e-pharmacy in particular. But even before this, for the last number of years, e-pharmacy has been developing quickly and regulation has been very slow to catch up with it. So what we want to do in this session is explore some different perspectives on the regulation of e-pharmacy. We're going to look at the scope and the nature of the developments in the e-pharmacy market. We're going to explore some of the opportunities that exist for enhancing regulatory performance. And then we're going to look at, we're going to contrast the way that e-pharmacy has been regulated in high income settings and in low and middle income settings. So we have three speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, and I have a co-chair, Prasanna Salingram, and what we're going to do is have three presentations back to back, and then have what we hope will be a really stimulating discussion. So we're going to start with Frank Wafula, who is from Strathmore University in Kenya. His research is focused on strengthening health sector governance across low and middle income countries, particularly through regulation. And he's going to talk about the development and regulation of e-pharmacy markets in India, Kenya, and Nigeria, drawing on a research project that we were involved in last year. The second speaker will be Rosalind Miller, who is a pharmacist who has transformed herself into a health systems researcher, having done a PhD in the area of health systems and pharmacies. She's going to look at how pharmacies are regulated in Thailand, the UK, and Germany, and some of the outstanding challenges in regulating these markets effectively. The third speaker is Catherine Goodman, also from the UK and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's a health economist and health systems researcher, and she's going to present plans for a new project that will be starting in 2021 that's going to explore the performance and regulation of e-pharmacy in Kenya and India. We are hoping that we'll be able to pause after the three presentations for some questions of clarification, and then we can engage in some discussion that Prasanna and I will facilitate together. Just to note, because of some other circumstances, the lineup of speakers has changed from originally, so we were sorry that one of our previous contributors wasn't able to join. And what that meant is we focused much more the session on e-pharmacy rather than on the broader issue of mHealth and e-health. So if you're here to hear about doctors on WhatsApp, then you might not hear much about that, but I think you'll find the discussions on e-pharmacy to be utterly fascinating. So welcome to participants, welcome to speakers, and I think what I'd like to do is hand over to the first speaker, who will be Frank Wafula from Kenya.
Just one additional information, housekeeping information. People can type in their questions, or even after the presentations, there is provision for you to unmute yourself and converse as well. So there is a possibility of that. So it is not just typing into the Zoom window, but also you can ask your questions live.
Great, thanks, Prasanna. Yes, we're an intimate group, so I am hoping that we can have what is much more an interactive discussion following the third presentation. So Frank, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cara. Can you hear me well?
Very clearly, thank you.
All right.
You might want to switch on your video, Frank.
Okay, all right.
Oh, there you are, lovely.
who's talking behind the scenes. So I'm just, gonna mute that on my screen. Yeah, so welcome to the session. As Kara mentioned, we are quite interested in keeping track on what's happening with regards to regulation of online selling of medicines, e-commerce in medicines, basically. And it's basically building on a piece of work that we started a couple of years ago. The team here was actually involved in the work, so I'll be presenting a little bit about that, but also just engaging in some broader discussions around some of the challenges and opportunities for regulators across low and middle-income countries. And so the question is, why the interest? I think a lot of us here would be aware that there's quite a lot of talk around e-commerce, which of course has been accelerated by the COVID-19 situation. So now, with governments actively, asking businesses to try as much as possible to minimize contact, that's just making stronger case for e-commerce, and medicines are not left behind. So it's a high dollar value market, according to Statista and other kind of open sources. Market studies, you're talking about over 100 billion USD in the next couple of years. And with that comes quite a lot of concerns about, who's regulating these providers. Are they actually following the rules in their respective countries? And certainly a lot of studies that have been done, kind of high level macro studies, have indicated that a lot of, these businesses don't even comply to the local rules from where they operate, yet they're operating globally. So it's clearly a major issue. And yet, even as a trend is growing in LMICs, we are not seeing a lot of discussions on how the regulatory system is going to, to adapt to that. And, it's even worse because these are the same countries, and, my country, Kenya, is one of them, where, it's always been a challenge, even regulating the brick and mortar pharmacies. So it's kind of just becoming a bit more complicated. So that's what led us to, this scoping study, basically just to estimate the size of what do these online pharmacy markets look like in Kenya, Nigeria, and India, and how are they regulated? And based on that, what are some of the opportunities and risks that regulators face? And so it was a very, kind of quick piece of work, just documentary views and about 18 interviews, very specific to usually the capitals across the, the respective countries, with a focus on regulators, professionals, pharmacy professionals, and communications regulators and other people in the policy space, but a very strong focus on the e-pharmacy providers. And so I'll just very, very quickly highlight some of the things that we found. So one, it's quite clear that it's a relatively smaller market, particularly in Kenya and Nigeria, perhaps bigger in India. But what was quite clear, of just going back about 5-6 years, is the trend was actually growing. So it was actually a growing market. And the thing is, and I'll talk about that in a bit, this was even before the COVID-19 era. There was quite a few players in the market, and we basically characterized, two types of models. And so these are provider-facing models and consumer-facing models. So as the name suggests, the provider-facing models are more focused, upstream basically. So from the retailer, to the suppliers and the other actors higher up the distribution chain. So it's about, linking the pharmacy to the retailers for more efficient and, cost-effective, more affordable procurement processes. And, the idea is that allows pool procurement and other mechanisms that allows the distributors to reach the retailers more efficiently. And hopefully then that results in cost savings. But of course, because it's really professional to professional type of business, largely, not always, but largely, we picked that there are minimal regulatory implications there. But on the other side, the consumer-facing models, so these are the ones that link the retailers to people in their households. So basically, the lay public. And usually the whole idea is for convenience. So you can get your prescription medicine at home, but also it's just, the whole idea is because you're not relying too much on the brick and mortar and the real estate, the prices need to be lower. But of course, the other advantages, potential to comparison across a wide range of products. There are issues of privacy if you're buying certain medicines. And there's a whole bunch of other advantages around this as well. But the thing we picked is there are major regulatory implications around this model simply because of the information asymmetry that you're talking about. But the other thing that we also picked up is, so they're the pure e-pharmacy models where they purely operate, online, and then there are those that are hybrid models, so they kind of have a pharmacy or a set of pharmacies, but they also have an online presence. And the latter is basically what we've seen kind of growing in numbers following COVID, because it was a way that pharmacies could reach people more effectively. And we talked about government policy triggering e-commerce across areas, and health is not left behind as well. So the other thing we looked out for is what does the regulation look like? And it's quite clear that the innovation, this new way of providing pharmacy services was running faster than the regulation. We picked some effort across all countries, trying to come up with a regulatory framework. But what was clear was the lack of sufficient evidence or information to feed into what that process should look like. And particularly, the risk that building on the older models of regulation that were just not effective may actually be more, may not be very productive, because this is an even trickier, space to regulate. Higher income countries, as Rose will say in a bit, struggle with this as well. So it's something that really needs quite a lot of thinking before proper regulatory frameworks can be developed. And, we also picked an element of self-policing. And a lot of, the firms that we talked about having mechanisms in place to reduce abuse. For example, having portals where, a client has to put a prescription before the medicines are given, or restricting the quantities, or even using pharmacy technicians to deliver the medicine. As I said earlier, the provider-facing firms tend to be more likely to be run by professionals because they're dealing with a wholesaler and a retailer. So they also made an effort to ensure that they're dealing with providers who are licensed appropriately. And so just focusing on the consumer-facing models, because as I said, they have higher regulatory implications, but also most of these models that we are seeing were consumer-facing. We saw a few opportunities potentially for regulators. So one of them is the e-transaction digital footprint, which might actually allow the regulators in some of these settings to follow, to track where the medicines are going. One of the biggest challenges we have in countries like ours is the fact that you can never really trace a product origin through the distribution chain. So this mechanism could potentially, a regulator could potentially ride on this to find a way of doing that. So the other thing is it can actually allow, restriction of selling, medicines, particularly without prescription, because that's a major issue with brick and mortar pharmacies. But since there's a provision to actually, force the buyers to include a prescription, then it makes it easier potentially to do that. But also other problems like selling partial doses of medicines are likely to be less of a problem if that mechanism is in place. The third point is debatable, but there's no possibility of selling products that don't have market authorization. Of course, we know that there are no geographic boundaries when it comes to online pharmacies, but it is possible in theory, perhaps using mystery shoppers or other mechanisms, to find out whether somebody can supply a product in your country, and if it's not allowed, then that could then allow the regulator to take appropriate action, and so that actually becomes a potential advantage. But also just the potential to actually look at the patterns of medicine use and potentially abuse, particularly sensitive medicines like antibiotics or narcotics as well. And then finally, there's always the possibility of lowering the end prices, which of course is a mandate of the regulator, improving quality without restricting access. And so this is just one of the, the kind of the comments that providers say. So, the clients have to upload a prescription to us, give them the medicine, the original prescription, and then on delivery of the medicine, they have to give the prescription as well. So that just demonstrates to us, the kind of effort that they're putting in place. As we come to the end, some of the risks that we picked up is, one of them is we know very little, about the conditions under which the medicines are warehoused or stored, because again, this is just a blank screen. You don't know where they're coming from. So that's a major issue. Perhaps concerns around product degradation and all that. There's also poor information about the quality of dispensing, particularly if you're using riders to deliver the medicines, and that then becomes an issue. Client has a question: how then do how are those addressed? The typical dispensing process. Of course, there's the issue of prescription abuse. Loading multiple prescriptions to different providers, that could happen because then particularly they're not taking the prescription and delivering the product. There's the risk of products degrading during transportation. You have cold chain products potentially, or more labile, more sensitive products. That could be a risk as well. And then, of course, there's just the broader discussion around personal data and concerns of security of information that you're putting online, saving someone. And so this is just a quote from one of the providers. We're not a pharmacy; we're a technology platform. We have separate apps for customers and pharmacies. The regulators don't regulate for price in the market, but how we do patients where you can get the best price. So this is a provider who's providing pharmacy services, but they don't see themselves as providing pharmacy services. They see themselves as providing a platform through which people can make. So that basically points at the kind of challenge that could be observed here. So in conclusion, it's a growing market, and with the global pandemic, it's actually been accelerated, which in a sense emphasizes the importance of coming up with proper regulatory frameworks. But they also use variations across models. That poses regulatory challenges because a one-size-fits-all may actually not work in that kind of market. We know the market is poorly regulated, and we know that technology is running, as in a lot of other industries, technology is running faster than than regulation. But we also know that the regulatory systems are relatively weak comparatively, and that then is basically a double concern then for these regulators, because they haven't done really well for what one would argue the easier water regulation. Now they need to regulate these guys, and you don't know where they're operating from globally. And then, of course, there are lots of opportunities and risks that I've talked about, and the fact that if we get this right, then potentially, could build on regulating other e-health kind of processes beyond the e-pharmacies. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was super interesting, and I think such an interesting reflection, both on how quickly these markets are changing, but also some of the challenges of coexistence of different models, whether that's different models of e-pharmacy, but also the fact that there's a big unfinished business of regulating bricks and mortar pharmacies, and yet new challenges for regulators in terms of design, of dealing with these new technologies. So thanks very much for that, Frank. We're now going to turn over to Rosalind Miller, who, as I mentioned before, is a pharmacist by her initial training and now health systems researcher. And she is going to share with you some information about how e-pharmacy innovations are regulated in some upper middle and high income countries, looking at Thailand, the UK, and Germany, and some of the ongoing challenges in regulating these markets effectively. So let me hand over to you, Rosalind. And welcome. It's really nice to see some participants here. Thank you very much for joining us. And after our third presentation, we'll move on to some general discussion and Q&A. So Ros, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cara. Is my sound clear?
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as Cara said, my name is Rosalind, and I'm from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and today I will be talking about the regulation of e-pharmacy in high-income countries. So it was in the late 1990s that the first e-pharmacies started selling medicines directly to consumers, and this first took place in the UK and the US. And since this time, the market has rapidly proliferated. So as Frank said, the market size of e-pharmacy globally is substantial in the tens or even hundreds of billions. And this global market is currently dominated by high-income countries, in particular North America. And within Europe, the market is concentrated mostly within the UK, Germany, and France. So before I go into the regulation, I just wanted to highlight some of the key issues that high-income countries are facing with respect to e-pharmacy. And there are certain aspects that carry significant public health concern. So in particular, as these headlines show, the key concerns are the sale of prescription-only medicines without a prescription, with antibiotics and addictive substances such as opioids being a specific worry, the sale of substandard and counterfeit medicines, and additionally non-health related issues such as data privacy. And as the picture in the bottom right corner highlights, many pharmacies who are flouting rules with respect to prescription medicines are in fact operating illegally, and these are often known as rogue e-pharmacies. So I just want to talk a little bit more about those. So whilst you do have legal and licensed e-pharmacies that generally comply with rules and regulations, although of course some may not be fully compliant, arguably the biggest problem that high-income countries face are rogue illegal pharmacies that are often run by large criminal networks. So what are these rogue pharmacies? They aren't licensed. They sell prescription-only medicines without a prescription, of which many may be substandard or counterfeit, and they often sell unapproved medicines. And as I said, most of these pharmacies belong to organized criminal networks, many of which have been the recipients of regulatory agency warning letters in their respective countries. So they're complex global operations with hundreds or even thousands of related sites. And in fact, a small number of criminal gangs own thousands of ever-renewing fake pharmacy websites. So this graphic on the right here shows a statistic from some 2011 research that indicated just 30 networks were responsible for over 50,000 fake drug selling websites. And the way that these networks work is that the operators will create a website template and then they run the back-end services, so things like payment processing and pharmaceutical shipping. They then offer those templates to affiliate marketers who will then operate the website on behalf of the network, drive traffic to the sites and take a small cut of the profits. And there are several well-known criminal networks, including Prescription Partners, E-Pharmacy and Worldwide Drugstore. It's also timely to note that a number of sites have proliferated in response to COVID-19. So NABP, which is the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, the regulators in the US that license pharmacists and pharmacies, conducted some research on rogue pharmacy activity, and they found that opportunists are using the pandemic to prey on fearful customers, essentially exploiting the public health emergency for profit. They reported that network affiliates are pushing a small selection of prescription-only medicines that have gained media attention as possible but unproven treatments. So things like chloroquine, azithromycin, lopinavir, furosemide. And importantly, these treatments are unproven and potentially dangerous if taken without proper oversight. The websites were found to include misleading and often frightening information about the disease. So for example, saying that COVID has a 40% mortality rate. And most of them are registered anonymously, which makes it difficult for law enforcement agencies to investigate the sources. So how do things currently stand from a regulatory perspective? So on a global level, there's no global regulator for e-pharmacy. So this would be difficult because most countries have different rules and different regulations. Whilst the WHO acknowledges that e-pharmacy is a threat, it has yet to issue any guidance. The Council of Europe's Medicrime Convention is an internationally legally binding criminal law instrument attempting to address counterfeit products, but it has little relevance to retail sale and supply. And then Interpol coordinates an annual effort entitled Operation Pangea to disrupt the sale of falsified medicines online. And so it's an international week of action. And in its first year, it was just working with 10 countries. In its second year, it reported taking down 237 websites illicitly selling medicines. And then this image here is from the 2020 effort that took place in March, and that was the 8th operation. So as you can see from the picture, it involved 91 countries, there were 21 arrests, they shut down 2,500 websites and seized $14 million worth of products. And this year they saw a rise in fake medical products relating to COVID-19. So things like counterfeit face masks, substandard hand sanitizer, and unauthorized antiviral medicine. And all of these were among the products seized. You also have third-party organizations acting globally. So things like the ASOP, which is the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacy. And this organization supports consumer education, research, and advocacy for the safe use of medicines online. And these graphics show some of their educational material. Internationally, a common regulatory strategy has been the use of verification schemes. So in the EU, for example, since 2015, all online pharmacies or retailers legally operating in the EU should display the EU common logo, which is shown in the second bullet. So it consists of a national flag on the middle left, which corresponds to the EU country in which the pharmacy is registered. And then if you click on it, the logo links you to the website of the national authority, which lists all legally licensed retailers. Similar, you have the Canada's CEPA certification mark, and in the UK, which recently left the EU, so can no longer use the common logo, the regulatory body, the General Pharmaceutical Council, operates a voluntary logo scheme, which online pharmacies can apply to display on their website. However, it is easy for fake and criminal sites to copy and paste these onto their websites, and customers may not know to even look out for this logo. In the US, the NABP runs a 3-year accreditation program in order to verify legally operating and compliant e-pharmacies. And within this, it includes .pharmacy verification. So this generic top-level domain was introduced in 2014 with the aim of providing consumers around the world a means for identifying safe, legal, and ethical online pharmacies. So it's absolutely impossible to change the suffix .pharmacy on a website. And if a website ends in .pharmacy, it's a sure way for customers to identify whether a site is legitimate. And it's appealing to legally compliant players because it signals authenticity. It automatically enables them to advertise on search engines such as Google, Yahoo, Bing, and social media sites such as Snapchat and Twitter. And then they'll also get placed on the NABP safe sites list. Further, the .pharmacy domain will signal to credit card companies like MasterCard and Visa that they're dealing with a legitimate merchant. There's also been some third-party organizations such as LegitScript who have set up their own verification and certification schemes. They're mostly in high-income countries, but they are also branching into low middle-income countries. So the approved seal displayed in the right-hand corner here for 1mg, that was actually the first Indian e-pharmacy to receive this verification. And they've got a useful search function on their website where you can look up any e-pharmacy. So I typed in pharmacy to you, which is a well-known player in the UK, and it came up and showed me that it's certified and it's legitimate. This is a screenshot from what it saw. And then on the right, I had a look online to look for some dubious sites, and I found this HQ Pharmacy Online 365. And indeed, it confirmed that it is a rogue operation. So that's a really useful tool for consumers. At the national level, regulatory approaches differ, and there's currently a lack of consensus on how e-pharmacies should best be regulated. So in Thailand, which is not technically a high income but an upper middle income country, e-pharmacy is altogether illegal. So it's essentially banned in the country. Whereas most countries have sought to incorporate e-pharmacy into their existing system of rule. So you could say that most places are managing e-pharmacy at the margins. And within this, you've got some more permissive environments. So for example, in the UK, there are no specific rules or legislation to e-pharmacy. It's just simply applied the rules that apply to offline to online pharmacies. And also there's been an embracing of e-prescriptions. So it's allowing for the dispensing of prescription-only medicines online. And you also have some stricter environments. So for example, Germany, until very recently, you actually had to mail your prescription in the post to the e-pharmacy in order to have it filled and dispensed through an e-pharmacy. And they also have tighter regulation on cross-border sales. So you can only legally sell pharmaceuticals from a few countries to Germany. But this represents a massive job for custom authorities. And then with the legal requirements varying from country to country, particularly with respect to prescription e-medicines, it throws up a number of cross-border challenges whereby customers can purchase medicines from legal sites in other countries, even if that's not legally compliant with the rules in their own country, which doesn't really seem right. So moving forwards, where might regulatory strategies go in the future? So one idea is the adoption of top-level domains like in the US. So .pharmacy, .apotheke, .pharmacy. If every country in the world were to adopt a universal approach using top-level domains, that could actually go a long way to addressing rogue and illegal pharmacies online. So as I said earlier, it's impossible to change the suffix. It's not possible to just copy or replicate it for a fake website. And also it's really easy for customers to determine whether the pharmacy they want to use is the real deal. Within the EU, there's a proposal for a new Digital Services Act, which is currently under review. So it's the first time that there will be a common set of rules on intermediaries' obligations and accountability across the single market. And some organisations such as ASOP see this as a real opportunity to address illegal online pharmacies. So if this act addresses domain name accountability, so it could make it compulsory for registries to keep a registrant database and require proof of identity, which currently isn't the case. It could also introduce know your business customer obligations. So what that is the idea behind that is that a business can't go online without a domain name, without being hosted, without advertisement, payment services, or online marketplaces. So these intermediary services have got a direct relationship with the businesses, and they're therefore best placed to make sure that only businesses that are willing to comply with the law will have access to their services. And it doesn't even mean monitoring their business customers' behavior or content. All it is would be asking them to identify themselves and applying simple due diligence checks. And if these are not in place, then the idea is that the intermediary should stop providing services until the business customer remedies the situation. And then finally, there's arguably great scope to improve education of the public, those actually buying medicines online. Another example from the EU is the Falsified Medicines Directive, which is a set of rules to protect people from fake medicines in the EU. And it obliges member states to inform the public about the common logo that I talked about earlier, and also about the dangers relating to falsified medicines online. And this report that I've put up on the right by ASOP EU looked at the compliance with this Article 85D about public education, and it concluded that efforts across countries were really variable. So whilst a few countries had made specific efforts, in many places it was lacking. And outside of the EU, it's likely that public education around online medicine sales could also be improved. So that's all I've got time for today. But thank you for listening, and I will hand back to Cara.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. That was, ooh, am I back here? Hello. That was great. And I think just again, emphasizing that this issue of e-pharmacy, it is a global health systems issue. It's something that's affecting countries of all income levels and in all regions. And I think this issue around the need for cross-country collaboration for it to really work, and coordination that is it's a promising area. And of course, the reminder that you have to work on the demand side as well, that it's not enough to try to intervene on the supply side, but informing consumers and educating consumers is part of the solution too. So thank you for that. Our third speaker is Catherine Goodman from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And so she is going to look forward to describe to you a new program of research that she is just starting with some of our collaborators who are here, and to get your feedback and ideas about ways that this research could progress, but also to tap into your network. So if you know of people who are also also researching in this area who have not got around to publishing yet, it'd be great to help to make connections and to make contacts between groups. So Catherine, over to you.
Just a brief interruption. People can type in their questions. I haven't seen any questions coming up. Of course, we can also do a live discussion. So that's fine.
Thanks, Prasanna. That's a great reminder. Okay, so Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prasanna and Kara, and great to see everyone today. So I'm going to tell you about a new research project which is just about to start, looking at the performance and regulation of e-pharmacy in Kenya and India. So the work you've heard presented already by Frank and Rosalind arose from a seed grant we had from the Wellcome Trust on regulation. And this seed has now grown into a larger scale proposal of research. So I guess we're at the sapling stage now. We hope ultimately to produce a tree of knowledge on e-pharmacy for regulators to draw on. And so that's what I'm going to talk about with you today, our plans for that work. You've already heard all the background and rationale from the earlier speakers, so I'm going to focus on our methods for studying these particular markets. So the team that's going to do this research comes from LSHTM, Strathmore University, and the George Institute for Global Health in India. We have, from each institution, we have pharmacy skills and also health systems research skills, and crucially some ICT skills, particularly from the iLab Africa at Strathmore. And we're also supported by our steering committee, who bring many different skills to advise us, and we're still establishing that. So we've chosen to work in Kenya and India. As you may have gathered, both have rapidly growing e-pharmacy markets, but they are still at very contrasting stages of development. So with India much more developed than Kenya at this stage. The stakeholders in both countries, we found from our scoping study, really view better regulation as a priority, but neither country has actually managed to enact a regulatory framework for e-pharmacy as yet. That's despite the fact that in India, there have been draft rules around e-pharmacy that have been pending approval for well over 2 years, but it's a highly contested field and it hasn't happened as yet. So our research project is going to be structured around these 4 objectives or work packages. We're going to begin by characterizing the e-pharmacy markets that exist in these 2 countries. Then we're going to assess their performance. We'll move on to a critical appraisal of their regulatory systems, and finally look to understand the policy processes that influence this regulation. So to begin with work package 1 around characterizing e-pharmacy markets, a first step, I guess in any study of a market, needs to be to understand who the players are. And this will also form the sampling frame for our research. So we're going to learn this through analysing online activity, using internet scraping tools and common search terms people use when they aim to purchase medicines. We'll be focusing on the consumer-facing e-pharmacies, either those that are based in Kenya and India or those that serve customers in those countries. And for each website we identify, we'll conduct a structured website review. So this will firstly involve documenting the scope of their products and services, whether that's their payment methods, delivery strategies, or the range of products they have. And then we'll do an assessment of their compliance with the national regulations and best practice standards. So we'll have a checklist for that, looking at key features of compliance, for instance, whether the name of the registered pharmacist is there, whether they have a system for the return of drugs, whether they are doing any unauthorized advertising, for instance. And this structured tool will be complemented by in-depth interviews with e-pharmacy managers to try and understand more about their business models. And we'll also look at consumer experience by monitoring online feedback. In work package 2, we'll move to assessing the performance of these e-pharmacies in actually serving customers. So we'll be using a mixture of standardized patients, or mystery shoppers as they're sometimes called, and medicine quality testing. So as a team, we have quite a lot of experience of using SPs or standardized patients in brick and mortar pharmacies, but this is going to be our first experience of using this tool online. Our SPs are going to present a set of standardized case scenarios. We've selected these to be products that are frequently sourced online, but which also raise a range of regulatory and public health concerns. So there are two types of scenarios. On the left-hand side, you can see the medicine-driven requests. So this is where a customer asks for a specific prescription-only medicine. So I might go online and try and buy an antibiotic or a diabetes medicine. And for each of these scenarios, we're going to present it in three different ways. Firstly, I'll try and buy with no prescription, then with an out-of-date prescription, and in another scenario, I'll actually have a valid prescription. On the right-hand side, we've got our second set of scenarios, which we call symptom-driven requests. So this is where the customer goes online and reports a certain set of symptoms to the e-pharmacy with the expectation that the e-pharmacy will then recommend the products for them. So we'll have two cases here, first gonorrhea symptoms and secondly chronic knee pain. And we'll do the latter with and without pregnancy to look for management of that contraindication for certain medicines. So how this will work is that SPs will be conducted in a random sample of the e-pharmacies that we identify. Our study staff are going to act as the SPs, so they'll be sitting at their desks, at their computers, shopping online, but they'll use a number of strategies to conceal their identity. So it's not clear to the e-pharmacy that there are loads of different requests all coming from one computer inside Strathmore University, for instance. They'll proceed through the encounter just as a normal online shopper would up to the point of payment, and they'll document each step as they go using a structured questionnaire and screenshots. They'll then complete the final purchase for a subsample of these cases, and once the medicine products have been delivered, the quality of a sample of these will be tested in the lab for dissolution and availability of active pharmaceutical ingredient. In work package 3, we'll turn to looking at the regulation of these markets, looking at the influence of global governance, but primarily focusing on national and in India state level regulation. So this is going to take the form of a document review combined with in-depth interviews with a wide range of stakeholders that operate in this sphere. And we'll be wanting to explore their perspectives on the current regulation and also potential alternatives. So when it comes to these alternatives, we'll be thinking of many of the ones that Frank and Rosalind have already mentioned. We might think about tightening statutory regulation, so better enforcement of who can operate a website, or maybe increasing flexibility, say allowing greater pharmacist prescribing. It could be using blockchain software, that digital footprint that Frank was talking about, to sort of monitor compliance throughout the distribution chain. Or it could be more persuasive measures, like encouraging the industry to have a code of practice or accreditation seals. It could be you using restricted domains like the .pharmacy that was mentioned, or perhaps consumer education. And then for each of these options, we'll be considering their likely performance against a range of criteria, from their fit with regulatory objectives, likely compliance, how big an impact they could have on quality of care, the implications for affordability and access, and also for regulatory capacity and funding requirements. So finally, in Objective 4, we come to acknowledge that e-pharmacy regulation is not just a technical question. It's also a really hotly contested area. So you've got on the one hand public health concerns, but on the other vested interests from the brick and mortar pharmacies and the existing e-pharmacies. And then you've also got strong economic pressures, perhaps to develop e-commerce and IT more generally. So all these groups are fighting their corner in quite a politicized environment. And this is particularly true in India, where you can see from these pictures, there have been national strikes of brick and mortar pharmacies. There have been a number of cases in the High Court against e-pharmacy, and recent controversy around e-pharmacy's involvement in the government's COVID app. So it's a very lively forum. So we'll be taking a policy analysis approach to this work package, looking at what influences the design and implementation of regulation. So we're going to begin with a review of policy documents, those legal proceedings from the court cases, and also media coverage to develop a timeline of key policy events. And from that, we'll identify what we're calling specific policy moments. So that's a point in time where regulation has either advanced or been stalled. And then we'll use in-depth interviews to explore these policy moments and how they're connected with each other through a combination of process tracing and using the 3I+N framework, which is looking at the influence of institutions, interests, ideas, and networks. So that's it for now. As we mentioned, this is research that's just about to kick off, so it's a really great time to have your comments and suggestions, which will be very welcome.
Great, thank you very much, Catherine. Get my video sorted here. So those are the kind of the three presentations. I think Catherine's presentation really pointed to all the sort of adaptations and innovations and methods that are needed to study a service that's delivered in a really different way from our sort of traditional health services. So she talked about using internet scraping methods to identify a sample frame and extending the standardized patients approach to online purchases. It struck me that it must be rather nice to be able to do a survey from the comfort of your own desk rather than spending a lot of time and resources in doing large-scale field surveys, a really different perspective on field work. And I think also thinking about those regulatory options, we haven't really talked very much in the presentations about kind of regulatory theory and sort of new thinking about regulation, but I think underlying your regulatory options was an understanding of the fact that regulatory approaches can vary in their degree of kind of coercion. So things that involve voluntary agreements amongst suppliers might be an easier option than going straight to a kind of a command and control form of regulation. So really interesting. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Prasanna to manage the Q&A. Prasanna, just to say, I really can't see any of the questions. I have not managed to get on the second site, so I'm going to rely on you to feed the questions through to our panelists. And I wonder, HSR team, is there a way of showing all of the speakers on the screen so we can kind of work more as a panel than as a direct Q&A. So Prasanna, over to you. Are there any questions from the floor so far? You can also, just to remind you, you can also I think put your hand up and ask your question because we're having a Zoom format rather than a passive webinar format. So over to you, Prasanna.
Yeah, I would request Catherine, Rosalind, and Frank to switch on their video so that people can, it could potentially look like a panel discussion. I have also not seen any questions coming up in the Q&A section. Maybe people would want to directly ask the questions. You can raise your hands or switch on your video, raise your hand physically. So any of those methods are fine.
Maybe while we're waiting for people to think of their question, I could ask a question. So I think maybe it's a question kind of to Frank, who's been observing these markets at close contact, maybe also to you, Prasanna, that the COVID-19 phenomenon, this expansion of online commerce and through that online pharmacies, is that creating new problems or are they the same old problems? Is it just an issue of, so how have the regulators responded to this kind of onslaught of demand for e-services? So Frank, I'll let you respond to that first, and then Prasanna, you could jump in as well.
All right, thanks, Cara. Yeah, so, I mean, that's one of, and I guess the pattern has been standard globally, but one of the strong government responses to the global pandemic has been encouraging e-commerce. So for example, we use Kenya as an example. So M-Pesa is basically a mobile money transfer wallet very popular across the country. And so the government got into this negotiation with the mobile service provider where they actually waive, the charge normal levy just to encourage people to purchase things online, and usually they use the mobile to pay for that. So there's really to try and limit the contact. So because of that, there's this huge push towards e-commerce, and the malls were empty and everywhere was empty. So in a way, it was a way of restricting movement without using rules. And as a consequence, and I think I hinted at this a little bit, what we saw is a lot of brick and mortar pharmacies actually established an e-pharmacy component alongside what they were doing. And so this is interesting because, and Kari, remember this, when we're doing our interviews, one of the things that came up, for the seed grant, for the work that I presented, one of the things that came out was part of the reason the regulator wasn't really worried about the emergence of online pharmacy was because the scale was still a bit low, compared to the brick and mortar. So it was one of those things where we worry when it becomes too much, and they will really act. But now that transition actually happened during a pandemic, and so they could not act because acting meant almost going against what the president was trying to do. So suddenly we have a lot of online pharmacies at a time when the regulator was just chilling, waiting for for the numbers to grow organically. So now we are basically caught in a situation where it's no longer just a discussion about technology innovation preceding regulation. It's about innovation being in Russia and regulation is still in Kenya. So they're basically miles apart, and it's almost impossible to think about how we are going to try and bridge that divide. And so what we are seeing locally is, and it links a little bit to the discussions that you've had, that Kara has hinted along, the role of theory. What you're seeing is what could potentially be discussions leading to smart regulation. So that is where the regulator recognizes that the market is too complicated for one form of regulation, command and control. And in fact, what we should now be doing is bringing in other players to see whether we can use a combination of instruments to influence both the demand side and the supply side. So in a sense, so there's been quite a lot of, and one of our advisors on the new project that Catherine has talked about is actually the president of the Pharmaceutical Society of Kenya. So I was having a conversation with him, and he said there's quite a lot of activity now among the regulator, bringing players together. What can we do about these? How can we make this work better? And that's very rare in Kenya because usually regulation is very supply side driven. You just see the website, new rules coming up. So I think this is actually going to be maybe the tail that wags the dog. So we might actually see the regulator changing a lot of how they do things, simply because the scale of the task that is out there now with hundreds of online pharmacies, and I'm not exaggerating, with different scales, how then do you bring in this kind of regulation? So the activity is there, but I suspect we'll see more and more of the regulator being willing to really engage and think outside the box when it comes to designing and developing regulation. And I think some of the ideas that Catherine has just presented, some of the things we potentially would like to explore, I think are going to become very important, not just in Kenya, but I think in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. And Kasana will tell us about India, about how then the system can learn about these and evolve. I think you're muted.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, no. On the ground, things haven't changed much. Only the volumes might have changed. Of course, the added dimension that Catherine also mentioned about the conflicts of interest. I mean, that has been the major story, actually, of 4 online pharmacies hitchhiking on a COVID app or a tracing app, which was riddled with privacy issues, and I mean it was a quagmire there, and those 4 pharmacies riding on that, I think that was the icing on the cake, so to say. But we are still the way we are, in the sense of schizophrenia, extreme romanticism to extreme skepticism, so we are swinging between the two. So yeah, the industry keeps on emphasizing the nature of it, but we know the digital divide and the inequalities and the inequities that we live with. One thing has changed maybe is that most of the established online pharmacies are insisting on prescriptions, but there also the situation is business as usual, as we saw 2 years back. Nobody is questioning if you're not presenting a prescription. A doctor will simply call you up and then say, you don't have any contraindications? Fine. And that would be a 2-second conversation and end of the story. And then you can have the what you call most stringent prescription only medicine delivered to you. But the brick and mortar people have been very innovative in some sense, that they are using the lockdown phases and all to generally deliver the medicines without asking for any prescriptions, just going on faith and just like that. So yeah, we are where we are, but the volumes have definitely increased in urban areas. Rural areas, I don't think there is any much difference.
Thanks. Any questions coming in on the Q&A? Questions or comments or observations?
Not yet. Yeah, people can directly ask. I think that's all.
I can see a couple of people have posted questions. Patsy posted first and then Brendan. So I wonder if it would be best if they'd like to unmute and ask their questions. Would that be okay? Starting with Patsy.
So I think I can no, can I?
Catherine, can you lead it? I'm not able to. For some
okay,
reason.
well,
Why don't we go to
now? Oh, we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you now, Patsy.
Yeah. Good day, everybody, wherever you are in the world. It's really been fantastic, and this new normal we are already into, it's really wonderful. I'm just wondering, with the regulations that took place in India, why they actually protested after such beautiful, regulation. And again, talking about E-Pharmacy, I didn't really put that one in the question, space, but so I wasn't actually seeing clearly. But I want to now use this opportunity given me to ask, what is actually the starting point of E-Pharmacy if we are trying to, embark on it? Thank you. Did you get my question?
I think so, Pat. Let's see if I can repeat them back. So the first was, maybe Prasanna, you could just sort of say why what was the problem that was being perceived by the bricks and mortar pharmacies that caused them to...
Exactly, in India, why they actually protested after coming out with such a beautiful, regulation.
Yeah.
As
and then the other...
Yeah, then the starting points in E-Pharmacy intervention. How do we start?
The selling... Pat, you're asking the selling point. So why is E-Pharmacy attractive? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, considering the new normal we are in, virtual trading is the intent now, or virtual intervention is the intent. So if you're starting, how do you embark on it? The starting point. Yeah. What are the modalities in place to start off?
Yeah, one or two
things. So maybe Prasanna, you might answer the protest issue.
Yeah, one is of course to protect their constituencies. That is one. There is always a business angle to that. The second is of course they're also raising the bogey that these people are prescribing, are dispensing medicines without prescription, which is dangerous. So that is the second one. The third argument put in the court is again the same issue of how without back-end, while there is stringent regulation for the brick and mortar pharmacies to operate, there isn't anything. It's a free-for-all sort of thing with the online thing. So that is the third issue on which they are operating. Yeah, basically these can all be contested. Going by the history of the brick and mortar pharmacies itself and their regulation, and the way it has been implemented. They are not anyway holy cows, but in some sense, yeah, these are the bogies somewhat raised by the brick and mortar. I mean, of course, there is no regulation in the first place, and there is no regulation in place for these online pharmacies, and that's a genuine concern that they have been allowed to run away with their own ways of operating. So that is, in short.
So Patsy, it seems like it's so India is a great place to go set up your e-pharmacy business because the barriers to entry are low and the regulation is limited. I guess, yes. So that's an interesting situation where
also related to the second question, the technological availability. Sorry, continue.
Okay, is it the case of not really understanding the processes put in place or something? Maybe there might be a gap somewhere that made them to, something must have fueled them to agitate.
All right, thanks, Pat. So let's return to Brendan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for your questions, Pat. Hello, Brendan.
Hi, thanks very much for the opportunity. So my question is, what happens now? So of course now the e-pharmacies are the way to go. Do we expect deregulation wholesomely? Because I know even with the existing regulations for E and ICT, there are moves to make it more, to increase penetration. So we expect much more deregulation for the E-related services. But for the brick and mortar, if I reflect, for instance, I'm based in Kenya now with Frank. If I reflect, for instance, on Uganda, I know there are regulations around distance, like which won't make sense with regards to e-pharmacies. I'm also thinking about who can prescribe what, for instance, how that will be managed in terms of brick and mortar versus e-pharmacies, because I don't know how they will be able to regulate that it's the right people who are prescribing, who are dispensing the right things with regards to e-pharmacies. So basically my question is around the effect in terms of the brick and mortar, but also the system, the health system. And I think the response from India kind of touched that, because the people who are protesting are thinking about those kinds of aspects. So maybe you could help respond to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Who wants to take that one on? Frank, do you want to start? And then I'm just thinking, I think maybe one of the things underlying your question, Brendan, also is a sense of what are the kind of distributional consequences, the equity consequences of the growth of e-pharmacy. So what about places where those kind of mobile deliveries are, are not economic and not economically viable as well? So Frank, any thoughts about those things?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. It's an interesting raise, and it's hard to tell how this is going to play out over time. So is it that, because actually, before I even respond to that, so I talked about a lot of pharmacies locally, including this online. So they're doing this in stages. So first to a brick and mortar, and then we need to do delivery because movement is restricted. So you actually tell people and you put notices and you say, we'll be delivering, and then you realize people are not coming here, they're in their houses, so they're not going to come and read and know that you're delivering. So the next thing is you need to go online, and so you say followers here, and then the next thing is you can now order. So it's in a way it's basically a way of the businesses surviving because when there was a lockdown, there was basically no movement in the entire place. So that basically means a lot of businesses will recognize this. What I call the hybrid model is likely to. I expect the hybrid model to be fairly popular now moving forward. So the brick and mortars are going to be running, both the physical shop and the online shop. And so, so Brendan is wondering then what do we do? So is it that you're going to regulate the online ones so that they can be a bit of a playing field? Or is it that you're going to deregulate the physical ones so that they can be a level playing field? Regulate by brick and mortar, just find a smart way of being the online one. And some of the the e-pharmacy providers we talked to when you're doing the interviews actually have the two of them, and they're two separate companies, and they found that quite interesting. And I think one of the explanations was so that if this one gets in trouble, this one is safe. So I think if you continue over-regulating me as a brick and mortar, I just push more business to online because I'm not regulated. And if you over-regulate me on the online, then I just kind of go back here. So and I think the question is really, we're going to see how this plays out as it goes. I suspect we will not know for a while because this is really something that is really we're talking about a lot of these changes happening over the last 1 year. And so what we tend to see with e-commerce in Kenya is a lot of it ends up on the mobile phone. So a lot of these transactions actually end up going mHealth or on the mobile phone one way or another. And that then also helps to address the equity issue. Because if you're talking about purely online as we know it, again, it looks very upmarket, it looks very, highly educated. When you talk about the mobile, so a lot of services, financial services not being provided through the mobile services. It's very easy for the e-pharmacy to move to M-pharmacy one way or another. So I suspect that's going to be a natural progression towards that direction. And then that deals with equity concerns, particularly in urban, among the urban poor and others. But I suspect logistics and operations will still make it really difficult for the more rural areas. And I know Prasanna has kind of hinted at that. So, Prasanna, you said in India, you think, the more rural and remote areas, the effect is a lot slower. I suspect that will continue being the case because penetration of health services there is poor anyway, even what would be brick and mortar are not there. So I suspect that that's going to be a slightly different dynamic. But in most of the high population areas in countries like Kenya, Brenda and Uganda as well and others, I suspect you're going to see quite a lot of mobile, this moving to the mobile. And the more reason why regulation needs to try to catch up, because once anything gets to the mobile in Kenya, like one of my colleagues likes saying, I have 99 problems, but a mobile phone isn't one of them. Once anything gets to a mobile in Kenya, everybody's gonna do it. So, and at that point, it's really tricky. So those are my views.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Frank. Catherine, I just wanted to ask you, are there any other questions in the Q&A? And if there are not, could I ask you another question? Okay.
I would like to
this
also
issue of
just
equity.
Prasanna was going to say something, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Go
sorry,
ahead, Prasanna.
Kara. The brick and mortar, institutions are not going to go anywhere. They're going to be there. The same thing happened with the other retail markets, for example, provision stores and all. So what happened was they reinvented themselves, all the brick and mortar people, to serve even the people who are wanting to move online and those sorts of things. So that brick and mortar is not going to go away easily. Also culturally, the relationship building, being in the locality, all these factors matter. For example, in India, despite the e-commerce, despite the ICT, despite the romance around that, I think still culturally relationships matter. And in that sense, if the local brick and mortar fellow has established a relationship, he will reinvent himself, innovate himself or herself, whatever, and then deliver it electronically in the sense of doing it e-way rather than doing the physical way. So I think brick and mortars are going to stay and they are not going to go away. What would happen is with the regulation coming in for the e-markets as well, I think a sort of level playing field might happen. So that's the additional point I wanted to make.
Thanks, Prasanna. So, Catherine, I just wanted to ask you, because I know that when you were sort of thinking through your proposal with your colleagues, there was questions about whether it would be possible to understand something about who is using e-pharmacy, and whether there were kind of differences in the socioeconomic characteristics of people who are using the sort of the technology enhanced access, and whether that would create a divide. But you didn't talk about that in your methods. Did you decide that it wasn't a question that you could answer with that kind of data collection?
Yeah, we thought we would love to know that. We'd love to have the economic profile of who uses e-pharmacy for what in both countries and compare that to bricks and mortar. But we couldn't think how to do that in a really rigorous, robust scientific manner and an affordable manner. So, to some degree, you can do household surveys or use household surveys to ask who has used e-pharmacy recently. We were expecting that at the moment, it probably is concentrated in higher income groups. So we weren't sure how effective that would be to get a large number of users. The alternative, and what marketers would do, would be to use more interest groups. So say for instance, there's a group of diabetes patients association, for instance, to source people from there. But again, you tend to get a rather unusual group of people that aren't a very representative sample overall. So we haven't really found a way of doing that at the moment. We're very interested in anyone's suggestions for that. But rather what our ICT colleagues have suggested is that one way to get consumer views is to use what's already online. So to use online complaints, to use social media, and also to use comments of all the associated companies, because e-pharmacies are an e-pharmacy, but then they're associated with a payment provider, or associated with delivery providers, or associated with advertisers. And so to look at those connections and look at the complaints that are raised through those connections. So that will give us more of a feeling of the experience.
Thank you. So am I correct in thinking we're down to our last 3 minutes? I am. Okay, so those of you who are in the room with us, this is your last chance to ask a question to this excellent panel. Either stick your hand up or just unmute yourself and ask your question. You've got another minute or so left. If not, I thought I'd just make one observation and maybe ask Rosalind to reflect on this. I think what's interesting about the response in the high income settings is it's quite joined up, right? It involves the police, and it involves the regulation, or the links to the sort of the ancillary services to the know your customer, and all the sort of the issues around sort of the integrity of business relationships and anti-corruption, anti-bribery. Do you think, I guess it's a question, how do you think we get that same joined upness in other countries where it is happening, where e-pharmacy is expanding so quickly? Are there good practices to learn from in terms of that cross-sectoral collaboration? Hard question, Rosalind, sorry.
No, so I think that the fighting of the fake medicine seems to be one area that has managed to manage a degree of cooperation, and that isn't just high income countries, like sort of Interpol efforts, that really is global, and that's working with regulatory agencies across high, low and middle income countries. The sort of intermediaries and the working with the businesses and the other joined upness, I think that's currently more aspirational. I don't think that's really happening at the moment, but I think that's where people see an opportunity to crack down on these more illegal businesses. So I think that's the main problem. Registered pharmacies are currently being regulated in the same way that brick and mortar are. They're inspected, they're expected to follow, the same principles of practice. The rules are no different. I mean, arguably they should be. Arguably, should you be allowed to sell antibiotics or opioids over online? No country's sort of yet to take that next step further and say these are actually different. But I think in terms of the joined upness, it obviously is possible if there's a will, like as the Interpol thing has shown, but obviously 1 week a year isn't enough, and they need to build on that.
Thanks, Rosalind. Prasanna, I'm going to turn to you and ask you in the last minute or so if you wanted to sum up or give any sort of summary comments or observations before we end the session.
I know one of the things was about how all countries are struggling, be it high income countries. The problems might be slightly different, but how the technology actually really races forward, and then the regulations are doing a constant catch up. I think that's an interesting observation. It is not that if you are in a higher income country, you are sorted in some sort. Yeah, so I think that's one thing that has come up. Just an additional point is about the digital divide. Even within the digitalized world, there is the divide between smartphones and the ordinary phones. And if an app is smartphone based, it's again going to be creating another layer of complexity or whatever. So that exactly happened with the COVID app. Because it was smartphone based, many of them could not be traced or tracked, and those are for all the romance and hoopla around the app and the tracking and the tracing and all, which was anyway unethical. But despite that, nothing, I mean, not much headway could be done. So that is another point. So the digital divide, I mean, there have been enablers of online payments, of M-Pesa, for example, what Frank kept talking about. I think those are the enablers. There are opportunities definitely of an e-pharmacy being able to track medicines, being able to also identify a faulty batch of medicines and then recall them. These are all advantages that you can have as opposed to a physical verification of a brick and mortar company or setup. But at the same time, the unscrupulous way and the way, I mean, in India, there is a very famous statement, wherever there is a law, there is a bylaw. So people do find ways of circumventing any law that has been brought about. So I think that is where, and of course, the perennial problem of staff and infrastructure for regulation, which costs. And because it costs and governments are weak, I mean, in the sense public systems are weak with very minimal investments, I think regulation is always going to be on a constant catch-up basis. I think that's in summation.
That's really helpful, really interesting comments, Prasanna. Thank you. And I guess the other thing, Frank, just thinking about we have a genie and a bottle issue, don't we, with this kind of explosion of business. I think it's really there's a degree of I think it's interesting that the pharmacies themselves are seeing it to be in their interest to help the regulators to engage in that dialogue and to find ways of signaling the good performing, the good businesses, so that they can maintain their position as kind of valid businesses doing important work in terms of increasing access to medicines. So let me end then just by saying thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to those who joined the session. It was great to have you here in the room with us, and we hope that you enjoyed it as well. And if you have any further thoughts about this field or research in this field, please do get in touch with any of the speakers from today. Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.